Hi, it's me, Tea Leaves. So this is a tea tales, a story thing. It's not the theory, although there's some theory stuff mixed in here and there randomly in the story. It's a story, not a theory. So, just a couple things real quick though, before I start here. This is the rough draft, and it's got lots of extra wording in it, and it's not written very well, and blah, 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 blah. And my go-to will always be to try and change it midway. I'm going to try and stop myself from doing that. And I'm just going to read it because there's just really no preparations for it. Who knows? Who cares? But anyway, there is some suggestive content to it, but it doesn't go overboard or anything. Just for anybody who's not into that kind of stuff, that's okay. I'm cool with that. Apparently so are my dreams. So, this is just like if you were in the bookstore and you picked up a book and you just randomly opened it to a page and just started reading. Because this is just midway through the story at some point. Actually, it's towards the beginning. So this is an excerpt, though, from Do Pirates Dream. The book Do Pirates Dream, I should say. Michael held up the phone. That was the call. Go. You two as well, he said, looking at Jimmy and Greg. They had just loaded their plates down with food. And then looking at their plates, they said, but Michael, annoyed, said, take them with you. But what if we want seconds? Michael didn't reply. He just simply looked at them. And they took off, just as Jen sneezed. He looked back at her. What was so important that you needed access to that car? Sean walked over. I need the keys, Ben. Oh, I'm sorry, Sean. I think I might have dropped them, she interrupted. Outside when I fainted? And then she sneezed again. It's cool. I'll get them. And then he left. Why, said Michael, again, trying to get an answer from her, did you need the keys to the car? As Ben walked past, oh, good luck, Ben said as he walked past and headed out. Jen didn't know if everyone was gone till she heard the garage door slam shut, and then she looked at Michael. Yep, it was just the two of them now. Why? Michael repeated. She had to clear her head because she forgot. Oh, I was getting my other bag I left in there. His eyebrows went up as he slowly turned his head towards her. Anger was beginning to creep into his eyes. She held out her hands to shield herself, waving them. But no electronics, she said quickly. No electronics at all. He grabbed her feet and untied her shoes. Then, using her legs, he dragged her off of the top of the counter, where he used his body, pinning her to the counter. He held up his hand, and two fingers snapped. The dogs which had been lying in the back of the kitchen stood to attention. Again he two-finger snapped and pointed to the warehouse room. The dogs obediently went through the door and took places so many feet from the door. She watched as they walked through the door. She had cringed each time he two-finger snapped. Now she looked at him. He had not taken his eyes off of her since he dragged her off the counter. If she was going to say something, now was the time. Michael, she started. He tilted his head at her and eased up on pinning her. She looked pleadingly into his eyes and grabbed his hands, holding them tightly. His eyes narrowed for a moment, but he said nothing. I should have not reconditioned the dogs. I was wrong, so please do not punish them. I may not agree with you in how you've raised them to be killers. However, they are still you have your reasons and they are still your dogs. I should not have used your hat to change them. As she said that, She released one of her hands and reached up to take the hat from her head. But, tap, tap, it was gone. Her mouth opened as she breathed in, taking her eyes from him to look about the room, then finally rested on the door to the outer garage. She must have left it out there somewhere. Her voice was shaky when she released her other hand from holding his, but he grabbed it back. She looked at her hand, remembering the ring she had found. "Oh, I'm sorry. I somehow have misplaced your hat, but I did find this ring, and it looks important." At the mention of a ring, his eyes looked even angrier, and his brows furrowed. It also caught him off guard, easing him to hold on to her hand, which allowed her to pull her hand free. She started pulling on the ring, but it wouldn't budge. "I'm sorry," she said as she struggled to pull it free. He looked at her hand, then grabbed her by the arm or shoulder, leaning in. His voice was dripping with malice. "You took my ring. You lost my hat." Using his grip on her arm, he shoved her forward into the room, but kept holding her arm. He stopped moving. Then he stopped moving and raising his hand, he added, "And you changed my dogs." And then he two-finger snapped. From the darkness inside the back of the kitchen, or from the back of the warehouse, the dogs came forward. Using her arm, he swung her around, facing the doorway leading to the warehouse room. "You, in there," he said, pointing with his whole hand. She took a breath and looked at the dogs, then stepped forward into the room. He had not told her how far to walk, so she stopped just beyond the doorway. "Keep going," he spoke from behind her. She began walking forward again and just kept going. "Stop," she heard his voice command. She stopped and stood, waiting in the darkness. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, but as she stood, her heart began beating faster, and her breathing, as well as her breathing, was faster. She tried to calm herself, which seemed to help, until she heard several paw prints with their clicking claws run past her into the darkness. She froze, and then taking a deep breath in and let it out. No one expected her home for a long time. No one knew where she was, and so whatever this man was going to do, no one would ever know. Breathe in, breathe out. In, out. Whatever happened, she was going to take it calmly. She had lost his hat, which, for all she knew, was very important to him. Sentimental value, perhaps. And she had definitely messed with his dogs. Evil dark crime lords need killer attack dogs, not dancing puppies. Evil dark crime lords, but her thoughts were broken when she heard the echoing sound all around her. It was the sound of his boots coming into the room. She imagined it was just the boots, because he wasn't in them. She felt they sounded a little heavy. Well, maybe they just needed to go on a diet. Too many Christmas cookies, you naughty little boots. She could work with this. Of course, they were his boots, so they would be intimidating and maybe a little scary. But if it got too bad, she could always threaten them with water. Shoes don't like water, right? Or she could take their shoelaces and threaten to hang them. Nothing else, she could kick them. The boots were near, but they had stopped. The boots were near her, but they had stopped. She breathed in and out. She heard a click. It made her jump, because boots do not have hands. They cannot turn off lights by themselves, and so as the boots now moved behind her, she realized the boots weren't alone. A strong arm wrapped around her, pulling her backwards and making her step back, which caught her off guard, causing her to gasp. He draped his right arm over her right shoulder, letting it lay against her chest. His hand reached around to his other arm. His breath was like hot, sweet venom when he whispered, "You're right, they were raised to be killers." Leaning heavy in her ear, his breath was hot, very hot. "And now we are going to remind them how to kill," he added. She swooned from the heat of his devastating words, but he held her. In a voice away from her, moving his head away, he spoke a command word that she didn't recognize. She looked around to see the dogs approaching, growling, snarling, and baring their teeth. He spoke this time from her shoulder, closer to her ear. "Break bone." The dogs, one by one, began turning to each other and attacking each other. As in German, he spoke again. She could recognize this German word as a German word, but not what it meant, as he spoke again. Some of them rolled on the floor, crying and whimpering in the shadows. She shook her head as she whispered no. She could feel tears stinging her eyes as she felt herself sway. He tightened his grip to squeezing and reminding her. Says question mark. My apologies. She mustered her strength and stood. Even as she watched the blood on the floor spatter on the floor from the shadows, tears started streaming down her cheeks, but she held herself up strong. "Circle," he called out. And the dogs, including the bleeding ones, all began to move forward towards her. He slid his arm from her middle down to where he had pinned her arm, beside her thigh. He closed his hand around hers except his thumb. As he pulled her hand up, he dragged his thumb against her skin. She wasn't sure if he had intentionally meant to do that or not, but no matter, she was going numb as she counted how many dogs had actually come back from the shadows, and as she watched the blood drip on the floor. But she realized they had not all come back. He straightened her arm along his and held their arms out to their left side. He laid his hand flat against hers, placing her hand under their hands, his palm laying on top of her hand. Then he commanded again, in just above a whisper, something in German, and then circle. They began to circle them. What started as a wide circle somehow became smaller and smaller as the dog's circle began closing in on them. Then he commanded in another German word, and the dogs sniffed his hand as they would go past him, pausing next to his hand for a moment before continuing to circle. Then he moved his hand up hers, trailing his fingers onto the ring, trailing a finger onto the ring, and then using that finger, he rubbed back and forth over the ring. "Yeah, I got it," she thought, reminding me I'm wearing the ring that isn't mine, and that he's assuming I stole it when I didn't. She sighed, but I did mess with his dogs. He moved his hand, and in one fluid motion, moved his hand to her wrist, slid around the side of her hand, palm to palm, fingertips touching until he curled his fingers inward, his fingernails pressed against her palm, leaving her fingers exposed and alone. She trembled as he commanded again, because now the dogs were so close he had only to whisper from her shoulder. In German he commanded something, and the dogs began sniffing her hand and growling and baring their teeth. Her breath was fast, and her hand began to tremble, and her hand continued trembling, but she held her ground. He whispered loudly next to her ear, breathe blood. And they began running their teeth along her skin and started nipping at her hand. Then, as if they had heard a silent command, they just stopped everything and sat. He uncurled his fingers, which made her jump. His other arm pulled her tighter. He flattened his hand against hers and spread her fingers apart, sliding his fingers in between hers, intertwining their fingers, moving their hands so that both their thumbs pointed up, And then softly in German he spoke from behind her. The dogs moved forward, sniffed their hands, and then licked them. She breathed in and shuddered as she breathed and then breathed out. They gasped as the other dead dogs came back from the shadows to join them. He moved close to her and in her ear so softly said, "They will never hurt you." She caught her breath, stopped, and then slowly turned her head to look at him. From just above her shoulder, he was looking out at the dogs. Then he turned his head, looking at her, and raised his eyebrows, and then smiled for a few seconds, then released her completely and stepped back from her. She stumbled a moment, now standing on her own, and then caught herself. She spun around to face him, her mouth and eyes both wide. He stood with his hands lightly clasped over each other. He had a slight smile still that was neither happy nor mean, but more like he was waiting for something, waiting on the surface, but underneath maybe not so calm. She started to shake her head and ask why. But her mouth was the only thing that moved. She stopped. All she could do was stare, and for once, be speechless. She was busting with conflict and question about what had just happened, but she just couldn't muster anything more, so she just stood and stared back. If it had been a staring contest, he would have won, because within a few moments she started to feel queasy and a little lightheaded. She needed to move. She blinked, looked down, then back at him with a quick glance. "Excuse me," she said, sidestepping him and walking past, out of the room. She walked back into the kitchen, flipped on the lights, reached for her cup on the counter to drink some water. She took a big gulp and held it because she felt like she might start choking or coughing. She closed her eyes to concentrate on finding a calm place inside, breathing in and out before she swallowed, and opening her eyes. She took a glance around, confirming that she was still alone, and that there was still food to be put away and a mess to be cleaned up. She busied herself with the mundane but welcome tasks. She also put her headphones on to help her focus and also block out the sound of any boots. Stupid boots. She was letting go after a while, quietly humming to herself, washing the dishes, including the plastic cups and utensils. Because, hey, you never know when something like that'll come in handy, and you should always be prepared. She laid out some paper towels and was placing the clean dishes on them, as well as the ones that went back upstairs. Okay. Then, using her peripheral vision, she saw him, at least the lower half of him, standing in the doorway. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, or if he was trying to get her attention, because frankly, she didn't care. She just kept busy and kept ignoring him. Oh, wait a minute, let me see what time it is. Oh, yep, I'm going to pause this because I'm actually going to make this probably more of a part. This is probably going to end up being like 3 parts. Sorry. Well, we're going to do another video then.